At the end of the Civil War in 1865, the victorious Union began to debate among themselves how to best reintegrate the former Confederate states back into the Union, or how to reconstruct the Union. The president after Lincoln's assassination was a certain Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, and he advocated a lenient approach on the southern states, but his opponents, the so-called radical Republicans, they demanded very harsh terms for the former Confederate states to re-enter the Union. In a political battle between these two sides, the radical Republicans eventually won the day, and they implemented what became known as Congressional Reconstruction in 1867. In this lesson, we're going to examine, first of all, who these radical Republicans were. What were their ideals and their goals? We're also going to examine this political battle between presidential Reconstruction of Andrew Johnson and the radical Republicans' Congressional Reconstruction. And we're going to assess the radical Reconstruction governments that arose in the southern states after 1867 with the implementation of Congressional Reconstruction. So let's first begin by looking at the radical Republicans. One thing that radical Republicans were in agreement on was that if the former Confederate states were going to rejoin the Union, all the former slaves or freedmen had to receive the right to vote, and that all former Confederate officials and office holders should be prohibited from voting. So they wanted to deny the vote to Confederates, give the vote to African Americans, to the freedmen. Now, while they might have agreed on their goals, the motivations of these radical Republicans varied very widely. On one hand, you had somebody like Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. He was an abolitionist before the war, and he was very much an idealist. He wanted to see that these freedmen, these freed slaves, have political equality. He also wanted them to have economic opportunity, and he wanted to reconstruct the Southern economy so it would be more like the economy up north. Now, other radical Republicans had a very different view. Many of them were political opportunists. They saw an opportunity for the Republican Party to expand into the South by giving these grateful freedmen the right to vote, assuming that freedmen would all vote Republican. Now, while some radical Republicans were idealists, others were political opportunists, some just wanted revenge. And they were angry that the war had been so bloody and so destructive, and they saw giving the right to vote to the freedmen as a way to humiliate and embarrass white Southerners who they blamed for starting the war. So the radical Republicans had different motivations. Now, the thing about President Johnson and his ideas about presidential Reconstruction, you got to remember about President Johnson is that he did not have the same point of view as the radical Republicans. First of all, he was a lifelong Democrat from East Tennessee. So he had no interest in advancing the Republican Party. See, he was very much like his hero, Andrew Jackson. He believed that the Union was a perpetual Union. He had opposed secession because he opposed the secession of the southern states at all. He believed the Union was perpetual and an indestructible Union. And there were many folks in East Tennessee, he was from Greenville, there were many folks in East Tennessee who agreed with it. East Tennessee did not have an economy based on cotton and plantations. It was very different than West Tennessee. So another thing about Andrew Johnson was that he didn't really care at all about the freed slaves. He had no opposition to slavery. He had owned slaves before the war. In conversations, he made it clear he didn't even like black people. So he had no interest in advancing the interests of the freedmen. Another thing about Andrew Johnson was that he had no grudge against the South. I mean, in his view, what had happened is that wealthy planters looking out only for their own interests had misled the people into the South into this horrible war. So he thought that the people of the South were innocent. It was their leaders who had led them in the wrong direction. And another thing about Johnson was that he believed that Lincoln had picked him as his running mate in 1864 because he wanted to send a message to the South that there'd be no ill will, that there would be there'd be a compromise and that a lenient approach to dealing with Reconstruction was the best approach. So basically, Johnson believed that he had Lincoln's blessing in everything he did. So in May of 1865, Andrew Johnson announced his plan for Reconstruction based on these more lenient principles. First of all, he issued a proclamation of amnesty. So basically he said that there was a full pardon for all citizens of the former Confederate states. Now, under his plan, those who were wealthy, those who had an annual revenue of $20,000 or more, they had to apply for a special presidential pardon. Remember, he blamed the wealthy for getting the South into this war, so they had to get a special pardon. Now, another part of Johnson's plan was that for the former Confederate states to re-enter the Union, what they had to do was to hold a special convention. And at this special convention, they had to repudiate their earlier vote to secede from the Union, and they also had to repudiate any debts that they had incurred when they had been members of the Confederacy. And finally, once they'd had a new election and elected a state legislature, their state legislature had to vote to ratify the 13th Amendment. In the closing months of the Civil War, Congress and the states had ratified the 13th Amendment to the Constitution that formally abolished slavery. And it had already been ratified up north, and now, according to this plan, the southern states had to ratify it as well to rejoin the Union. Now, for the most part, the southern states accepted these requirements, and they all fulfilled they all did what Johnson asked them to do. And Andrew Johnson issued thousands of pardons to many Southerners. Now, what happened, though, was that public opinion in the North became very angry at what was going on in the South. You see, in the North, it was generally believed that the South had started the war. And so many Northerners believed that the Southerners needed to show that they were sorry, that they were repentant. And when they did not see that happen, they were very angry. You see, what happened in the South was when they held new state elections in the South after they'd fulfilled Johnson's plan, many former Confederate officials were elected to high office. In fact, like the former Confederate Vice President, Alexander Stephens, people in Georgia elected him to be their new U.S. Senator. Another thing that infuriated the North was that the South acted like nothing had happened. Across the South, in state after state, they enacted what were called as black codes. Basically, what these codes did was to reduce the status of freedmen to the status of slaves in everything but name. Black people could not serve on juries, they could not own property in certain towns. And these measures were designed to keep basically the freedmen as basically in a reduced subservient state. Mississippi even refused to ratify the 13th Amendment. On top of that, in 1866, news reached the North that there were riots in Memphis and New Orleans, and white mobs had lynched many, many freedmen. And news of these mobs and these violence and these riots, it really was shocking to the people of North. They came to believe that the Southerners weren't sorry at all for what they thought they had started the war. So all of a sudden, across the North, there was more and more public support for the radical Republicans and their belief that the South needed to be really taken to the woodshed, that harsher treatment was necessary for the South. Now, in 1865, when all these newly elected congressmen and senators came from southern states to take their seats, the northern representatives in Congress told them to go home, said, hey, we don't need you, you're not wanted, we refuse to accept you. So in 1866, what started was an ongoing political battle between Andrew Johnson and the radical Republicans who controlled Congress and were gaining more and more public support. In 1866, for example, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, and Johnson immediately vetoed it. Now, there were enough votes in Congress to override his veto. Now, this act was very important. It served the basis of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which in effect guaranteed freedmen the same rights as white citizens. Now, going into the fall of 1866, you had congressional elections going on, And Johnson decided to actively campaign for candidates that were running against radical Republicans. It was a very ugly campaign. He wanted to get people who were anti-radical Republican elected so that he would have more power and more influence in Congress. But this was a very ugly and divisive campaign, and in the end, because of Johnson's campaigning, it ended up hurting his standing with the American public. For one thing, radical Republicans were very successful in attacking his character. I mean, Johnson was accused of being an alcoholic and a drunkard. At the same time, Johnson, he went on it was called the stump speech. He would go from town to town campaigning for candidates that he supported, and he only hurt himself. You know, he would often get very confrontational and use a lot of rough language and violent language, and all he did was turn off the voters. So when it was all said and done, in 1866, radical Republicans actually gained additional seats in Congress. So they were even in a stronger position after the elections than they had been before the election. So going into 1867, the radical Republicans had a firm control of Congress, and that's when they implemented what became known as Congressional Reconstruction. And the first thing they enacted was the Military Reconstruction Act. What they did was that they divided the former Confederate states into 5 provinces, and each was under a military governor, and they installed 20,000 federal troops in these provinces. The only Confederate state that was excluded from the Military Reconstruction Act was the state of Tennessee. East Tennessee had a lot of Republicans in it who were Unionists, and they had control of the state legislature and the governor's office, and so Tennessee never had to suffer under the Military Reconstruction Act. Now, according to the Military Reconstruction Act, these provinces could enter the Union as a state if they met certain conditions. First of all, they had to have a state convention, and when they had their state convention, freedmen had to be allowed to vote. Second of all, the state convention had to draft a new constitution which guaranteed all freedmen, the former slaves, the right to vote. Finally, the new legislature that came to power under the new Constitution, they had to ratify the 14th Amendment. Now, in the course of the debate in Congress, Thaddeus Stevens at one point proposed that properties that had been confiscated from former Confederacy officials should be taken and used to provide the freedmen each with a 40-acre lot of land. Later on, there was a lot of talk about each freedman getting 40 acres and a mule. But that measure was defeated because some congressmen thought that measure was just a little too harsh to take land from Confederate officials and give it to the freedmen. Well, anyway, to implement this Military Reconstruction Act, Congress passed the second and third Military Reconstruction Acts, and what these did was that they gave the federal troops the authority to oversee these elections. You know, so federal troops would be active in holding these elections and also be there to make sure that former Confederate office holders and officials could not participate in these elections. Now, as part of their plan, radical Republicans voted for the Tenure of Office Act in 1867. Now, the goal of this act was to keep Johnson from using his constitutional authority as commander-in-chief to interfere with the enforcement of the Military Reconstruction Act. Remember, they were using federal troops, and they wanted to make sure that Johnson didn't try to interfere with what the federal troops were doing in the South. So under the Tenure of Office Act, basically what Johnson could not do, he could not fire any members of his cabinet without first receiving congressional approval. The reason why they put this measure in is because there was a person on the cabinet by the name of Edwin Stanton. Edwin Stanton was a holdover from the Lincoln administration, and he was the Secretary of War, so in charge of the military, and a fellow radical Republican. So they wanted to keep him in office so that he would be in charge of overseeing this operation and making sure that Johnson didn't interfere. Now, Andrew Johnson believed that this new law, this Tenure in Office Act, was unconstitutional. He believed that as President of the United States, he could fire anybody he wanted to. So in 1868, he went ahead and he fired Edwin Stanton. And Immediately, the radical Republicans responded by, in the House of Representatives, they voted to impeach, which is basically an indictment against Johnson. He became the first president in American history to be impeached while in office. And he was impeached mainly on the charge of violating the Tenure in Office Act. Now, he was put on trial. Now, in an impeachment trial, after a president is impeached, he is tried by the Senate, and 2/3 of the Senate has to vote to convict, to expel the president from office. Well, the vote was very tight. It was 35 in favor of expulsion to 19, and it was just one vote shy of getting the 2/3 majority needed to get rid of Johnson. So he was saved by just one vote from getting thrown out of office. Now, after it was all said and done, Johnson actually tried to win the nomination of the Democratic Party. He was trying to become the Democratic candidate for president in 1868, but he lost out to a very popular governor of New York, a man by the name of Horatio Seymour. Now, in the election of 1868, obviously the Republicans weren't going to go with Johnson, so they went with a war hero. They have an old strategy. They went with Ulysses S. Grant, the guy who had saved the Union. And it turned out to be a really close election. Grant won the popular vote by only 500,000 votes. And 300,000 of those votes came from newly enfranchised freedmen. He won the 300,000 votes from former slaves in the South, and that was a part of his margin of victory. So the congressional Republicans won the day. They implemented military reconstruction. Now let's take a look at these governments that were formed under the Military Reconstruction Act. Now, by 1868, all the former Confederate states, except for Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana, had already been readmitted to the Union under the terms of the Military Reconstruction Act. In 1869, Congress voted that the 3 remaining states would have to have additional requirements. They would all have to ratify the 15th Amendment to join the Union. The 15th Amendment was designed to guarantee freedmen, the former slaves, the right to vote. You know, the 14th Amendment gave them equal rights. The 15th Amendment guaranteed them the right to vote. So the 3 remaining states complied with those requirements, and by 1870, all the former Confederate states had re-entered the Union. Now, in the South, in the early 1870s, Republicans controlled all of these state governments in the former Confederacy. And the way that these majorities were achieved was that the Republicans, of course, had all the votes from the freedmen, the former slaves, but they also had key votes from white Republicans who lived in these states. Now, Southern Democrats, they referred to these white Republicans, they had nothing but contempt for them. And they referred to them as either carpetbaggers or scalawags. I guess scalawags is a term for mangy cattle. So basically they were carpetbaggers or mangy cattle. Now, the Southern Democrats, from their perspective, these white Republicans, these carpetbags and scalawags, were nothing but greedy vultures, you know, feeding on the ruined South. They were immoral opportunists and traitors and scumbags. Now, so is that true? Well, a lot of these carpetbaggers were Northerners who had come and settled in the South. Now, a lot of times, they were simply former Union soldiers who had been stationed in the South, and they married Southern women. You got to remember that in the South, most of the white male population was dead. In Alabama, 2/3 of the white male population died in the war. So there were a lot of widows and unmarried women. So a lot of times these Union troops, they would come down south, meet a nice girl who was a widow, and they'd marry him. So a lot of the white Republicans were just Union soldiers who had married Southern women. Now, some of these carpetbaggers from up north came for good reasons. Some of them were missionaries and abolitionists, and they worked for what was called the Freedmen's Bureau. In the closing days of the war, in 1865, Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau as an organization to help the freedmen, to provide them with jobs, to help them learn about an education, to get them medical care, to help children and widows. And a lot of these carpetbaggers were missionaries and abolitionists who worked for the Freedmen's Bureau and were very idealistic. So not all the, I mean, I'm sure there were some carpetbaggers that were greedy vultures and traitorous and whatever, but not all of them. Now, the scalawags were Southerners who supported the Republican Party. Now, some scalawags, a lot of these scalawags were simply Unionists, people who lived in the South but who opposed secession. Like in places like East Tennessee and in the Appalachian regions of North Georgia and North Alabama, these were parts of the South where you didn't have plantations or slaves, and these were areas that were strongholds of the Unionists. And many of them after the war were Republicans. And many of them were the ones who supported the Republican Party and were considered scalawags. Now, some Southerners believed that the best way to get the Southern economy back on track and to recover from the war was just to join the Republican Party. James Longstreet was a Southern Confederate general who became a Republican and went into business and became a very successful cotton broker in New Orleans. So not all the scalawags were scalawags. You know, some of them had legitimate reasons for becoming Republicans. Now, the Southern Democrats, they believed that these new radical Republican governments that were set up in the South were all very, very corrupt, and they accused them of corruption on an epic scale, you know, taking kickbacks, accepting bribes, doing a lot of graft. And Democrats portrayed black Republicans in the worst possible light. They accused these newly elected African-American officials as being ignorant puppets and fools, portrayed them in a very negative light. But are these charges true? Well, there was a lot of corruption across the country. Public corruption came to new heights across America. But at the same time, these Republican governments across the South did do a lot to rebuild economies that were in turmoil. They built new schools. They established new public colleges and universities. They built hospitals. They built new railroads. A lot of the debt they incurred was due to all these projects to rebuild these ruined economies. And a lot of the African Americans who served as office holders did serve with great distinction and were not fools by any means. For example, Hiram Revels was elected from Mississippi as an African American senator and served with great distinction representing his state. Now, the thing about these Republican governments was that they were very, very unpopular among the majority of white Southerners who remained very, very loyal, zealously loyal to the Democratic Party. Now, what we see happening is that many whites who are Democrats organized secret societies. We've talked about secret societies a lot, but these secret societies were set up to intimidate African American voters and to intimidate Republican voters from voting. And these people who joined these secret societies viewed Republicans and the federal troops as occupying forces. They saw themselves as freedom fighters against these evil occupiers. Now, there are a number of different secret societies, but the most famous was the Ku Klux Klan. Now, this was originally founded, it was actually founded in West Tennessee, mainly to fight pro-Republican militias from East Tennessee. It was part of the Tennessee Civil War, but it expanded from Tennessee across the South. Now, in 1870 and 1871, Congress passed a series of force acts that basically broke the Klan. Federal troops came in, and leaders of the Klan were arrested and jailed. But eventually what happened is that the unpopularity of the Republican Party led a lot of Southern whites who were Republicans to change sides. You've got to think of it this way. If you're a Republican and you're a union guy and you come down here and you marry a Southern woman and she's a Democrat, after a while, you know, your wife's a Democrat, you're going to become a Democrat. You husbands realize that. So that's what happened over time. And so you have a situation where more and more white Republicans are becoming white Democrats. Now, there were many Southern Democrats who were called redeemers because they wanted to redeem the South from the evil Republicans. And they mounted a very public campaign to try to get employers not to hire or provide credit for freedmen. A lot of freedmen had become sharecroppers, and they relied on landowners for credit and for jobs. And now these redeemers were encouraging landowners to not hire or give credit to these freedmen to keep them from voting. Also, there was a lot of violence and intimidation used across the South Whenever there was an election day, there were shootings and violence and mob action directed against freedmen to keep them from voting. So over time, the Democrats were able to reclaim a lot of the southern states. By 1877, only 2 states in the South were still controlled by Republicans, South Carolina and Louisiana, and that was it. Now, the final blow to Reconstruction governments was the presidential election of 1876. In this election, the Democratic candidate was Samuel Tilden from New York, and his Republican candidate was Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio. Now, neither candidate had, actually Tilden won the popular vote by a slight majority, but neither candidate had a majority of the electoral votes, and the reason for this was that in 3 states in the South, Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana, there were 2 different sets of electoral votes. There had been a lot of fraud and voter intimidation in all 3 of those southern states, and so the legislatures had produced 2 different sets of electoral votes, one for the Democrat and one for the Republican. So there was a sense that the election was disputed and no candidate had a majority of the electoral college, just like in earlier elections, it went to the House of Representatives to decide. And when it got to the House of Representatives, Democrats and Republicans struck a deal. The deal was this. The Democrats agreed to vote for Hayes as long as he promised as president to pull all the remaining federal troops out of the South. And they agreed to that. Rutherford Hayes was elected by the House to be the new Republican president, and the first thing Hayes did was to withdraw all the troops from the South. Now, what that did was that you got to remember that these troops were the only protection that black voters had from violence and intimidation on election days. So when those troops were removed, the African American voters had no protection. So basically, after 1877, the Democratic Party was able to dominate elections. And pretty much the Democratic Party controlled the South all the way up until the second half of the 20th century. Now, what's interesting is that despite all that intimidation and those threats, 70% of eligible African American voters, they voted in the election of 1880, and they voted for the Republican candidate, James Garfield. So what happened is that Southern legislatures in the 1880s and 1890s, they took action to keep African American voters from voting. They instituted poll taxes, like you had to pay a tax just to vote, because they knew that a lot of African Americans were too poor to pay the poll tax. They instituted what were called literacy tests, where you had to prove that you could read or you had to understand the Constitution in order to vote. And this was designed to keep mostly illiterate African American sharecroppers from voting. So these measures were designed to keep African Americans from voting. They didn't want them voting Republicans. Now, when historians look at Reconstruction and they look at the fact that in the years after Reconstruction you had these literacy tests and these poll taxes, and when they see that African Americans were in great poverty, working as sharecroppers and very poor and illiterate, it's often people would say, well, obviously Reconstruction failed. The ideas of the radical Republicans failed. Equal rights were not guaranteed for the freedmen. They did not have economic opportunity. So you could say that the hopes of the more idealistic radical Republicans were thwarted. But it's also important to remember that what came out of Reconstruction were the passage of the 14th and the 15th Amendments by the radical Republicans. And these important amendments set the stage for and were the basis for the important civil rights movement of the 20th century. So that concludes our survey of U.S. history through Reconstruction.